President Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, Dr. Kristín Ingólfsdóttir, Rector of the University of Iceland, and other distinguished guests. I am Kristinn Schram, Director of the Center for Arctic Policy Studies. On behalf of the Center and the Institute of International Affairs at the University of Iceland, I'd like to welcome you all. We are eager to get started on these 2 days of conversation on sustainability, cooperation, and governance. In the beginning, you should ponder the end, or so goes the Icelandic saying. So I'd like to use this opportunity and invite you all to a reception at the University of Iceland at the end of today at 6:30 at Háskólatorg at the University of Iceland, our main dining hall. But let me give the floor now to the Rector of the University of Iceland, Dr. Kristín Ingólfsdóttir.
President of Iceland, Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, Excellencies, Members of Parliament, distinguished guests, very good afternoon to you all. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University of Iceland and our Center for Arctic Policy Studies to discuss the consequences of climate change on the circumpolar region. Now, the Center is a forum within our School of Social Sciences for interdisciplinary collaboration in the field of Arctic research, emphasizing policies of states and institutions, non-state and corporate actors, and broader aspects of governance, culture, and society in the Arctic and the high north. Now, one of the privileges of being rector of the university is to be able to catch a glimpse into different disciplines. My own field is pharmaceutical chemistry, but I sense reading your agenda that it must be a fantastic reminder of the importance of interdisciplinarity in the study of Arctic policy issues. And the focus of your seminar being recent developments in governance and management of the Arctic region, in particular challenges of sustainability and cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, President of Iceland, has been a dedicated advocate of furthering collaboration and dialogue of Arctic issues worldwide. He initiated the Arctic Circle Assembly to promote international dialogue on the future of the Arctic. And the assembly will be held later this week here in Reykjavik, and I know some of you are attending. I'm certainly looking very much forward to participating, and it's my great pleasure my great honor to welcome President Grímsson to the podium for his opening remarks.
Distinguished Rector, Ambassadors, Excellencies, dear friends, it is indeed a pleasure to see so many of you coming together to participate in this highly important and topical dialogue on the transformation of the Arctic. Of course, it's possible to approach that task from many directions. But I think it is important in the discussions and the dialogue to realize that the Arctic has so recently become a territory of cooperation and dialogue that there is really no other case in human history where a major part of planet Earth became in such a short time the concern and the active playing field of so many leading powers in different continents. Let's not forget that in the early years of the 20th century, the Arctic was still unknown and far away. Even my father's generation learned about the early discoverers who brought news of these distant areas. And some of the early explorers, both the distinguished Norwegians and even William Stephenson of Icelandic Canadian descent, were so honored and so famous in the early part of the 20th century that even many people in this country wanted to make William Stephenson the first president of the Republic because of his fame of bringing big parts of Canada to the knowledge of the so-called informed world. Of course, the indigenous people had been there for thousands of years. But we in Europe and the Western world are relative newcomers to this territory. I sometimes also remind the Arctic states that even not only the Republic of Iceland, but the United States, the Federation of Russia, perhaps not the Danish kingdom, which has existed for a long time, but all the other Arctic states are relatively young compared to the indigenous communities who have lived in the Arctic long before, centuries or even thousands of years, before our present state structures arrived on the scene. And then, in the second half of the 20th century, when the world of science and research and politics had gradually become aware of the Arctic, the Cold War closed the area off again. So for the second half of the previous century, it became perhaps the most militarized territory in the world, with every form of military technology created being placed somewhere in the Arctic, ranging from Alaska across Canada to the military bases in Greenland and Iceland and across the Atlantic into the northern part of Russia. And for my generation, brought up with the Cold War and the completely frozen relationships in that part of the world, to imagine that so relatively soon after the end of the Cold War, the world would come together in active and constructive cooperation on the Arctic is in fact almost unbelievable, especially for those of us who have spent most of our lives realizing how difficult politics can really be and how rarely new things happen in the field of politics and international relations. Definitely not positive new things. And whatever we say about our disappointments and frustrations with respect to the Arctic cooperation in the last 15 or 20 years, my view is that how we have succeeded, the 8 Arctic states and others, to construct the Arctic cooperation in the way we have, is perhaps the most outstanding example of positive achievement in the world in the last 20 years. I know it's a strong statement. Some people might even say overblown. But then I ask you, take a look at some other parts of the world. Take a look at the difficulties in the Middle East. Take a look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Look at the tension in some parts of Asia. Look at the difficulties in the political transformation in Latin America and Europe. And more or less outside the radar screen of international awareness, the 8 Arctic states gradually, and the active community of scientists and activists and environmentalists and indigenous people, this broad democratic community that came to surround the official cooperation of the governments and the state, were able to transform the Arctic into a territory of not only positive dialogue and discussions, but ultimately creating treaties, rules, and regulations. I sometimes tell my good friends Bill Clinton and Al Gore, it is a paradox of how difficult this journey was, that even their administration, as enlightened it was in terms of the environment and climate change, maintained the view that the Arctic Council should be as limited as possible. There was a long list of tasks it could not do. There was no secretariat. There was only a meeting every second year. There were definitely no treaties or any serious negotiations. Yes, maybe some studies by academics and scientists, but that was it. And if that was the view of Bill Clinton and Al Gore in the 1990s, imagine the rest of them in terms of their expectations. But somehow, the community that surrounded this cooperation, the community of scientists and experts and activists and environmental and indigenous people, gradually moved this new baby on the international scene, the Arctic Council, forward. So when it came with the two path-breaking reports during the Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Climate Assessment and the Arctic Human Development Report, it was a manifestation of how far the Council had traveled in just a decade, or even less. And let us acknowledge, in this forum talking about climate change and the impact and the influence it has on our activities and our needs to come together, that before the IPCC reports, it was the Arctic Council Climate Assessment Report that was perhaps the greatest pathbreaker and the landmark event in the international discussion about what was happening to the climate of the globe. And I mentioned this here today not only to provide a historical perspective, but to make us all remember in our discussion of the challenges and the task, that given the state of play in the world, not only in the last 20 years, but let's say in the last 200 years, how the Arctic Council has managed to establish itself as the core of this cooperation with positive results is a remarkable diplomatic and political achievement. Especially important because last year, as we all know, the decision of the Arctic Council involved the invitation to other states from faraway parts of the world, Asia and Europe, to join other observer states. So now we have more than half of the G20 countries in one way or another at the Arctic table. Think about it for a minute. The extraordinary transformation of a territory which for the entire part of the 20th century was either completely unknown or a no-go zone because of the military conflict caused by the Cold War, has now become a territory of cooperation for more than half of the leading economic powers of the world. Not only Russia and the United States, but the leading economic powers in Europe and in Asia. And that makes the challenge we all face even more important, because how are we going to make constructive use of these new Arctic players? How are we going to involve China, Japan, India, Singapore, Korea, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and others? And there is a waiting list. I know that. I mean, Mexico has already decided to apply. The United Arab Emirates is considering that since Singapore was accepted, there's really no reason why they should not also be at the table. So the list will get longer. The table will become more crowded. And I, for one, welcome that opportunity. And why do I do that? Not because it would make our task more complicated, because climate change has been one of the core issues of my active public life for the last 30 years or so. And I fundamentally believe that what's happening to the ice in our part of the world is perhaps the strongest political argument to the rest of the world that action is indeed needed. When people ask me, why is China so interested in the Arctic? My answer is very simple. If you look at what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years in the early winter months in big parts of China, with extreme weather patterns causing enormous destructions to infrastructure, to food productions, to electricity grids, to railway lines. Destruction far greater than Storm Sandy caused so famously in the United States. These colossal disasters in China, not just once, but twice in recent years, were primarily caused by the melting of the Arctic seas in our part of the world. And if you are a leader of a country which is being hit again and again, year after year, with monumental natural disasters, you of course concern yourself with what is the primary cause. That is why leading scientific institutes from China, the Polar Institute, the Tibetan Plateau Institute, have started active cooperation with us in the Nordic countries and elsewhere, learning from the scientists and the scholars. We could, of course, put forward many other arguments, but my case here this morning is simply this. Their interest, their participation in the Arctic affairs is natural, should be welcomed, and can become extraordinarily constructive. But we should also, as I did at the opening of the Arctic Circle Assembly, when it for the first time came together last year, express what I then called the Arctic House rules. And you know, if you have been in a dormitory in a British university, or if you have stayed in some camp somewhere, or you have arrived as the new entry in some establishment, you soon learn that there are some house rules, in addition to the formal regulation of how you should behave. So I take this opportunity here today, in the beginning of your discussion, to reiterate what I said a year ago about the Arctic House rules, which I hope the new arrivals, the states around the Arctic table, will observe, as we have in the last 20 years in the Arctic gradually come together as a community to create these informal house rules. The first is to maintain the culture of an open dialogue, an informal style of deliberation, but also the enduring personal friendships and mutual respect which have made the Arctic cooperation in recent years so successful. And when these new partners arrive on the scene, perhaps, as is normal and understandable, more used to other ways of diplomatic dialogue among nations, it is important that they adjust and their representative to this tradition of an open, constructive, and practical dialogue. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the preeminent role of science and research in Arctic policy making must be maintained. And I believe that is one of the key reasons why the Arctic cooperation has been so successful, because maybe not the only case, but there are not very many cases of constructive international cooperation among states which have been so directly based and motivated by scientific institutions and scientific research. Knowledge based on expert advice and scientific projects has been the core of the Arctic policy making since the establishment of the Arctic Council. The respect for the facts and the scientific evidence has been the guideline which has enabled us to be so successful. And thirdly and finally, within this Arctic dialogue, a profound respect for the indigenous people, their history, their human rights, their communities, their culture, their tradition should be maintained, because, my dear friends, it's their land, it's their future, it's their fate that we are discussing. We are all newcomers to their homeland, and we should therefore show profound respect when we come with all our knowledge and sometimes our political arrogance into this discussion, and definitely with our economic corporate interest, we should humbly acknowledge that we are entering their land. We are mingling with their culture and their custom and their faith. And I'm positive, very positive indeed, that the representatives of those states that have now been accepted, states from Asia and Europe and elsewhere, as part of the Arctic family, will respect these views and these traditions. I've seen that in the organization of the Arctic Circle, which, as the rector mentioned, in the end of this week will come together for the second time, having now already more than 1,300 people from 34 countries already taking place. Political leaders, representatives of government, scientists, experts, corporate heads from many different parts of the world, as well as environmentalists and representatives of the indigenous communities. It is indeed a remarkable manifestation that we already now have a global Arctic. Some people might dislike that fact, but there is no way to deny it, whether we like it or not. A territory which was mostly unknown to the informed world when my father was young has now become a new global economic and political and environmental playing field. And there is no roadmap of how we should go ahead. That is the challenge, but for intellectuals, that's also the fascination. Because this is perhaps the only time that we have together the opportunity to create a successful roadmap for a big part of planet Earth. We have never before in human history had that responsibility and that opportunity. And that's why I welcome you here today and have the honor to declare this conference open. I welcome you again also to the Arctic Circle Assembly at the end of this week. We have now decided it will take place every year in Iceland in October. It will, according to its organization principle, allow any organization, any partner to organize their own meetings in their own name, with their own agenda, with decision over their own speakers, making this town for a number of days a true Arctic village where we come together as friends, but above all in the spirit that we will make this challenge successful. To put it simply, we are not going to make a mess of it, as has been made in so many other parts of planet Earth. That is our challenge, that is our responsibility, and it's up to all of us to make that happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for setting the scene for us so excellently, with inspiration and also a challenge to approach this subject as it deserves to be approached. I'm Alison Bales. I work at the University of Iceland, and I have the pleasure but also the tough task of moderating this afternoon's panel. Tough because we have 8 speakers in just 2 hours. They have all been warned very clearly that they have only 15 minutes each. I must warn them again that I will be a tough moderator. When each of them has spoken for 13 minutes, I will be sitting in front of them looking fierce and holding up this sign. And after 2 minutes, if they're still speaking, I will look even more fierce. I will start standing up and threatening them. I realize also that 2 hours is a long time for the audience to listen. And I would suggest that when we've had the first 4 statements, I will give you a 5-minute break, but it will really only be 5 minutes, enough to stand up, stretch your legs, sit down, grab a cake outside or rush to the toilet, but it will be a strict 5 minutes. And if we succeed in all that, You will have an excellent time at the end of the afternoon to discuss, to debate, and to challenge and ask questions of the speakers before we go to the excellent party, which has also been mentioned to you. Now, I'm going to introduce each speaker very briefly. If they want to explain more about themselves, I encourage them to do that. And as I think is very proper, we are going to start with the country which has the chairmanship of the Arctic Council at present, that is Canada. We have Joël Plouffe, who is a research fellow at the Centre for Inter-University Research on the International Relations of Canada and Quebec. And he is going to tell us about the development of Canadian policy towards the Arctic. And he says also give a critical account of how it has been handled under the present administration of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So welcome, you have the floor.
So I'll start it right away. I've got almost 50 minutes left. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you, Alison. Mr. President, it's nice to see you again in your part of the House of the Arctic. It was great to have you in Montreal this year, and very interesting to see the relationship between Quebec and Iceland very well going forward. This afternoon, I would like to talk to you about, in a very brief time, the evolution of the Canadian foreign policy in the Arctic. At least since the end of the Cold War, it's hard to go back all the way up to the 1920s, 30s and 40s. There's very interesting elements there that is part of the Canadian foreign policy that has relationships with the North. But I won't get into that today, I won't have any time. But what I would like to just try to do in some minutes is just try to see how the Canadian foreign policy is today, and to explain that, I think we need to understand how it was before the arrival of this government here, which is the Stephen Harper government. It's an interesting phenomenon right now, very much studied by Canadian foreign policy scholars in Canada. Just generally, we have been seeing a shift in Canadian foreign policy. There are school of thoughts, ideas that have been addressed in many publications. And what I would like to do is to look at those ideas and from some international framework during the 1990s to see how that has evolved today in what some scholars are presenting as something called neo-continentalism in Canadian foreign policy. This is a new set of ideas that are different than the ideas that were presented before with continentalism and liberal internationalism, which was part of Canadian foreign policy for years and years before. And with looking at the Arctic today, maybe we'll try to see if there are some elements that correspond to this framework of neo-continentalism. So before we get to that, I would just like to present briefly these school of thoughts and these ideas that help us explain certain trends in Canadian foreign policy. Again, I won't go into the Cold War time where you would find some continentalism and some liberal internationalism. And continentalism during the Cold War, according to the scholars, is more pragmatically oriented and around geography, where the relationship between Canada and the United States was evolving, and many decisions were made because of geography and not because of other national interests that evolved eventually through Canadian foreign policy. But the continentalism that we see mostly with the arrival of Brian Mulroney in the 1980s, and that followed afterwards, and that came back in the beginning of 2000s, is mostly oriented around Canada-US trade. That is a key part of it, commerce, economic prosperity. So trade policy is extremely important for both governments here, at least for Canada, throughout its foreign policy. We can make rational choices through our objectives of national interest, always having, I have a broken cassette.
Always having an extra mic.
Thank you. Yeah, so having access to the US market is extremely important, and we can see examples of that throughout the history, just by Mulroney and the development of NAFTA in trade between both countries. The conversion of values, so sharing common values for continental prosperity is extremely important. And through this kind of relationship, this trade relationship, it gives Canada a way to speak its ideas and to present its own interest in Washington, and it gives Canada this sense of independence and sovereignty on a continent that is shared by a very powerful state and a less powerful state like Canada. And finally, maybe just this idea of giving Canada some kind of role, engagement with the United States, following the leader a bit, following how the U.S. Acts on the continent for security and defense, and following through. So again, there are roots of this during the Cold War, and then the core idea of this is it's based on economic prosperity and trade. This brings us to this idea of internationalism, liberal internationalism, which has been the default, I guess, way of explaining Canadian foreign policy since the Cold War years and after the Cold War. Promoting Canadian interests and its values through institutions. The idea, the core idea, and this is often the image that we have of Canada on the world scene, is a very Pacific country, is part of the global system, is a world citizen, believes in peace, and it would like to follow its foreign policy through these ideals. So you have these objectives that are there, is giving Canada some kind of responsibility on the world stage to manage conflicts, truly believe in multilateralism for cooperation, support for involvement in international institutions, and use our own national resources for stability on the world scale. And of course, international law is extremely important here. And then it brings us to the last one, neocontinentalism, which is a new set of ideas that has been studied a lot through Canadian foreign policy research over the last several years, at least since the arrival of the Harper government. It is a synthesis based on neoconservative values and ideals through fiscal conservatism, power devolution, laissez-faire, minimal state intervention, moral right, and law and order. Maybe the only thing that could bring these together, what scholars would say, is that both truly believe in the democratic values and promoting democracy across states. So this would be the only thing that would actually link both of these. Neocontinentalism and continentalism could sometimes resemble both of them often. But continentalism is, like I said a while ago, really based on trade and on economics, where neocontinentalism becomes interesting. Not only that is important for trade and commerce, it's also important for defense and security. So when you merge both of this, you get something new, which we call neocontinentalism. And through morality and other neoconservatism values, it becomes also very different than continentalism. Not only that we want to coexist and have a voice in Washington and advance our interests through Washington, our destiny is actually based through the prosperity of Washington, D.C. and the United States. And this will give Canada some kind of influence on the world scale, which is therefore the core of its foreign policy. It's actually a political project that's driven by neoconservative ideas. Scholars will argue that, for example, continentalism, let's say driven by Brian Mulroney in the 1980s and the beginning of 1990s, was not a political project. It was more pragmatically driven by economic needs and not an ideology and not a strategic culture either. And neocontinentalism would be said that came out following at least 9/11, where some window of opportunity would have opened and some ideas would have been projected throughout Ottawa, and this would be the beginning of neocontinentalism, and that really started to solidify itself during the arrival of Stephen Harper in 2006. 7 core elements when we think about neocontinentalism. So based on neoconservative values, on moral clarity, we believe in right, we believe in wrong, so we need to choose camps. Promote democracy, try to restore the Canadian state on the world scale. Often would be criticizing the Liberals, saying that through multilateral institutions, Canada was not enough present on the world scale and needed to be more present now. Our image needs to be more present as an important state on the world scale. Strengthen commerce and security with the United States, of course, a clear alignment with the United States to become more prosperous on the continent. International institutions are not extremely important because they don't give enough voice for Canada. If Canada wants to have a strong voice, it needs to go through Washington. It's basically that. And reject multilateralism because it does not help to promote Canadian foreign policy goals. What is interesting when we look at the Arctic, for example, and this is not complete, this is just a preliminary assessment of history, and there's many things that I did not put into this slide that I could not put in this slide. But I think these are important things that we need to look at when we look at these ideas and foreign policy since the end of the Cold War up to today. I call it these years of 1990s is, in my view, golden years of Canadian internationalism in the Arctic, and we often forget that because these are very idea-driven years. A lot of people, scholars to policymakers, a bit what the President was saying today, the share of science and policy was extremely important in Canada at that time with other states. And even today we talk about Canadian-Russian conflicts, but when you look at history and during the Cold War, this idea of neighborhoodness between Canada and Russia is extremely important. It emerged in the 1920s, 1930s, and even at the end of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, we were talking about a shared northern neighborhood between Russia and Canada. And this reflects of the certain policy decisions that were made after the Cold War through internationalism, the rapprochement with Russia, starting to create the idea of having an Arctic Council in the late 1980s. So having multilateral reunions, meetings to create this forum with circumpolar states. The idea of neighborhoodness was there. Circumpolarity existed, which doesn't exist today anymore. This idea of a circumpolar world was very present and was a way to promote Canadian national interests. So this idea of working together throughout foreign policy, human security was extremely important in the 1990s, seeing the Arctic as not only a zone of conflict, but a zone of peace that we all know, and the idea of delimitarization was very prominent at that time. An extremely important document was the 7th report from the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade. I like to read it often because these ideas that were archived in this document are important, and they are still seen today in some decisions in Ottawa and in many of our discussions. What is interesting at this time, and for the discussions that we're having today in the Arctic, regionalism was extremely important even at that time. Subnational governments working together from northern to higher Arctic issues was extremely important, and Ottawa was pushing this idea at that time through Jean Chrétien. Scholars, thinkers were getting together more often, making a lot of recommendations, and there seemed to be a lot of good reception in Ottawa for these kind of recommendations. And at the end of the 1990s, another window of opportunity opened. Climate change was becoming more and more prominent. There was many military in Canada who started to assess the problem of Canadian capabilities in the Arctic. Climate change, more shipping, new issues started to circulate, and probably more of a unilateral approach to Canadian foreign policy emerged at that time, pushing ideas based on this vulnerability that was emerging at the beginning of the 2000s. So this is maybe the continentalism that arrived in the Arctic at that time, maybe a shift in the security discourse in Canada. Happens in 9/11 also. 9/11 had a big impact on Arctic affairs in Canada. The security perimeter went even further north, and I remember arriving in Anchorage at one time after 9/11, and I would see the security, cautious, be careful, there might be a threat to your security. So this idea of 9/11 and insecurity, continental insecurity, made its way all the way up to north also. This created some issues in Ottawa also, from the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien, who was scared of this Americanization of security. Where is the Canadian voice at that time? So the Conservatives at that time used this opportunity to try to gain some votes also, to say, well, I think that we are all vulnerable and we need to all work together more, not only in the South but also in the North. So security is extremely important, and more discussions must happen between Canada and the United States. Climate change became even more important at that time. I won't get into the Hans Island issue, but you can remember this time was very interesting. This is when the conservatives and the liberals in Canada were really having a good argument to see who will win the future elections. And at this time, this was really interesting because we were talking about two things, continental security, but also rejecting the United States as a threat to our own national security. Scholars would say that at this time when we had all this discourse about sovereignty and the Northwest Passage and the US as an enemy was actually a good electoral card to use because there would be no implications in having such a discourse. And then some could win some votes because many would say that the United States and Canada since 9/11 were getting a lot too close and Canada was not promoting its interests and being sovereign enough. So this is something that scholars had seen at this time. Now neocontinentalism. This is just preliminary ideas of things that happened in 2003, 2006. Like I just said, you had some that were pushing the United States away, but after Stephen Harper got to power, there is a sense of rapprochement between the United States and Canada that you can see through documents. But it took a bit of time and some contingencies also. You have, when Stephen Harper arrived in power after 2006, military issues became extremely important, and if when you come back to the literature, neocontinentalism is very prominent. The only answer to address new security issues in the Arctic would be through military capabilities. So we will find the list of promises that were made in the Canada First military defense strategy, the new acquisitions capabilities in the Arctic. We all remember what happened in 2007. Many things, a lot of ice melt in the sea routes, the flag at the Arctic, at the North Pole, and this idea of use it or lose it from Stephen Harper happened at that same time also. So maybe I will just end on these important elements when we talk about neo-continentalism that we should all be looking into more further. I think 2010 is a very interesting year because for the first time in the Canadian Arctic Statement for Canada's foreign policy in the Arctic, you actually can document and see how there is an alignment between the United States and Canada in that document, where the United States is actually named as Canada's first partner in the Arctic. And that we had not seen before in such policies, where you'd had all the actors were important, but here the United States were core. And then the other three meetings are important also. The 2010 Coastal States meeting in Chelsea, Quebec was also an interesting phenomenon where the Harper government tried to maybe reshape how the relationships in the Arctic functioned, where only the coastal states were invited. So Canada would have a bigger voice with the United States in the Arctic region through this new A5 format. And then through the Canadian Arctic Council chair, and I'll stop there because my time is up, which is really interesting is this idea of institutions in Canadian foreign policy in neo-continentalism, where institutions are not important. And here this is interesting because the Arctic Council is actually not very much talked about in Ottawa. The institution is not very important in Canadian foreign policy through John Baird, or who is the foreign minister of Canada, or through Stephen Harper as the Prime Minister. So I thank you for your time and I will stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, because in a short time you have given us both facts and a conceptual framework, which I think is extremely interesting. And I now welcome Dr. Michael Corgan to the floor. He is an associate professor from Boston, but he is also a very frequent visitor and teacher and general good friend for our university here in Iceland. His subject is US Arctic strategy, but he has already said to me that he is not sure if there is such a strategy. So welcome. Thank you.
Right. I can shave a few minutes perhaps because it is the U.S. strategy. I'd like to thank Kristen Traum and others from the Center for inviting me here. And I think we're all honored to have the President of Iceland, Dr. Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, whom some of us consider a fellow political scientist. It's nice to have him here. All right, let me begin with what, if I can figure out how to make this work. What button do I press?
Push the button on the computer.
All right. Okay. Yep. All right. Ah, got it. Well, I call this the U.S. and the Arctic. I mean, we are the superpower. Some people think the superpower in the world, and that's the way it ought to be. But anyway, are we a superpower in the Arctic, or are we a spectator? And I mean that not entirely snidely, as you will soon see. I want to give a very brief history of the U.S. and Arctic because it's rather interesting. We didn't know it was there for most of our history, and some of us still don't seem to. In 1867, the Secretary of State, Seward, purchased Alaska from the Russians. Now, this wasn't an attempt to get Canada. It was to keep the Europeans out of the North American continent. And this was the last bunch of Europeans who were there, although I must say the the French had tried a few years earlier in Mexico. In any event, Seward bought it. Here he is explaining to the cabinet where it is. And he even visited 2 years later and talked about building up Alaska, saying, we're going to build it up, and he listed some countries it could be like, even Belgium. That's what he said. Okay, there was a gold rush in Alaska. That's the next time it came into the American consciousness in the 1890s. But unfortunately, by the time the people in what came to be called the lower 48, that's the continental states, found out about it, all the gold was gone, and the net result was a bunch of American would-be prospectors stranded in Canada with no food and no money, and depending on the kindness of not strangers, but the kindness of Canadians, which of course they did get. If that was Seward's folly, the next is another set of follies. President Grimson talked about the explorers, and he didn't mention any Americans, but that's not that we didn't try. First of all, there was Admiral Perry, who claimed to have made it to the North Pole on dog sled. No, he didn't. He didn't come very close even. But in fact, he didn't even get there on his own feet. He was on the sled, and his quartermaster was pushing him all the way to where he thought was the North Pole. And when Perry came back to the States to talk about it, he never mentioned this guy, Matthew Hinson, maybe because Hinson was black. But Perry didn't get there. Then Admiral Perry, he was a lieutenant commander at the time, said he flew over the North Pole. Well, his records show that he really didn't. But this is something out of The Wizard of Oz. If he didn't fly over the North Pole, Congress gave him the Medal of Honor for having flown over the North Pole. So if you've seen those characters, you know, the lion doesn't have any courage, so they give him a medal. The woodsman doesn't have any emotions, they give him a heart. Well, anyway, where it became serious for the United States, even in World War II, we lost some islands to Japan in the Aleutians. It's not quite in the Arctic, I know. But most Americans weren't aware of that. Where it became very serious and very important, as was said earlier, was the Cold War. And the U.S. was trying to show it now had control of things in the Arctic. And we saw pictures like this coming up frequently. Here is USS Skate surfacing at the North Pole. Other ships, Seawolf, had gone under the North Pole, but Skate actually managed to surface at the pole, and the crew got out and ran around for a bit. That was to show the rest of the world we are there and they are not, at least not yet. Okay, after the Cold War, there have been new developments for the Arctic, and I think they're much happier developments. I think we'd all agree. So that's what I want to look at, are the post-Cold War developments. Well, first of all, the first president, and as President Grimson mentioned, was Bill Clinton, who had an Arctic strategy. Sorry, I can't tell you what it is. It was secret. It may not have been technically secret according to U.S. public code, public law, but it wasn't distributed to anybody. It was held in close to the chest, and nobody knew about it, but it was there. It was in 1994, 20 years ago. Well, when he leaves office, the next president coming in, George Bush, does produce an Arctic strategy. It's the first time there is a public Arctic strategy document for the United States. Unfortunately, it was issued in the last week of his presidency. And that's sort of the things that presidents do when they're leaving town, is they give a lot of pardons to campaign contributors who got caught and sent to jail. They get presidential pardons. And in this case, George Bush issued a Arctic strategy. Mostly it was because of the Homeland Security issues, and it has two titles, National Security Presidential Directive 66 and Homeland Security Presidential Directive 25, if you like bureaucracy. One of the things that disturbed people about this, like the overall U.S. national security strategies, was the idea that we would operate independently anywhere we chose to because the Cold War institutions were antiquated and slowed us down, and besides, some of the people dared to disagree with us. A broad Arctic treaty was considered not necessary. The Arctic Council, as we've heard, had its limitations, and there was an Antarctic treaty, which the U.S. did participate in, but the feeling in the White House was that there should be no such treaty for the Arctic. Interestingly, very interesting for the Bush administration, there was a recommendation that we join the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 3, in order to have a voice at various UN committee meetings, especially the one on the limits of the continental shelf. There was a response, as there would be, to the Bush strategy, even carrying over into the next administration. There was the usual bureaucratic thing that all the government agencies wanted to show that they'd been paying attention to the president, so we had conferences and meetings and all of that. But if you want to know what policy is, look at a country's budget. There was nothing new allocated for the Arctic. The command structure was very complicated, and that didn't change. No new forces were sent there. The final result of this was what the Quadrennial Defense Review called, we would have domain awareness. That means we know it's there. If you like bureaucracy, this is it, domain awareness. I mean, really, what does that mean? Senator Murkowski, a Republican senator from Alaska, and a very popular one, incidentally, held a set of hearings. Now, I heard somebody mention a bad word, ice melting. Well, she's a Republican and she knows her party doesn't believe in global warming, therefore the ice can't melt. It's an ice-diminished Arctic. In fact, the Commandant of the Coast Guard at the time congratulated her on finding the right word. Ice diminished, perhaps the Inuits were making daiquiris or margaritas. And that's the phrase that's still used. I've been at conferences at the Naval Academy in Annapolis where I went, and it's still the ice-diminished Arctic. Governor Parnell at those hearings said, Alaska is America's Arctic guardian. And Mayor Edward Ida of the North Slope town, which is a huge expanse, sort of like Reykjanesbær, it's a big sprawling thing along our coast, said, most Americans don't even know that Alaska is part of America. So the Department of Defense finally weighs in with their assessment. We want to make contributions to the Arctic, but we have to avoid being late and avoid being premature. That's bureaucratic for nothing's going to happen anytime soon. However, there was this from the military. We have to involve in anything we do the Arctic's indigenous communities. And, of course, the current fiscal climate, there was a sequestration of the U.S. budget, cutting here and there. There was going to be no money in the Arctic. In fact, the report mentioned we may build some infrastructure, including a hangar. This is a superpower. It's going to build one hangar in the Arctic. Okay, now, not to let it stop there, President Barack Obama came up with an Arctic strategy. And this, I think, has a breathtaking message. The United States will partner with Alaska. I'm still, that's a quote. That's right there in his letter. I'm still trying to figure that one out. He did mention, however, again, reinforce this idea of indigenous people being incorporated, but obviously U.S. policy is looking somewhere else. There is a pivot to Asia. There are rumored to be problems in the Middle East and so on. And of course, like a good bureaucratic document that doesn't do anything, there were no timelines assessed, there were no allocations of fund, assignment of responsibilities. Well, that's where the Obama administration stands. However, what was driving some action was the Arctic Council chair coming up in 2015. So the recent developments, bringing up to this year. In July, a retired Commandant of the Coast Guard, Rear Admiral Robert Papp, was named as U.S. Special Representative for the Arctic. And so he will be the U.S. man on the chair. Now, there's a point here that's going to affect U.S. politics for the next couple of years at least. He's a special representative. And one of the congressmen from the U.S. from the state of Washington said, we have ambassadors to Fiji and Tonga, but for the Arctic, we just have a special representative. The reason for that is, as a special representative, he is not technically an officer of the government. Therefore, he does not need Senate approval. And the coming election, I think most of us see that the Republicans will not only hold the House, they'll take the Senate as well. So we're going to see more and more of that. Just, you know, the U.S. doesn't have a national security advisor. He's a special representative to the President for National Security Affairs. Therefore, not a government official. Therefore, the Senate has nothing to say about him. But Pap is very interested in the Arctic, but he's retired, and the current Commandant of the Coast Guard doesn't seem to have that same interest. I've been talking to members of the intelligence community, and here's their assessment. Happily for all this, everybody in the military and the defense establishment, the security establishment of the United States sees little chance of conflict. What we do see going on up there that might involve some kind of quasi-military operation are what I call constabulary issues, really policing issues that Coast Guards do, smuggling, polluting activities, that sort of thing. The venue for cooperation that the U.S. government will be following will be search and rescue coordination. There's not many resources up there now, and everybody seems to be working on that. Also, there's education in the U.S. I just recently got together a meeting of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in New London and the U.S. Naval War College in Newport. They're about 70 miles apart, 110 kilometers apart, and they have an Arctic Studies, Center for Arctic Policy Studies at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. I think they stole the idea, Kristen, from you guys. And the Newport School is a graduate level school, and they have an Arctic program. And they had never gotten together until I called a meeting recently, and we're now talking to each other. There's also a unified command structure for the Arctic. So, what are the prospects for the Arctic? In spite of what both sides say, Republican and Democrat, it's very unlikely we will ratify UNCLOS 3, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, because after all, the UN is full, as one party has said, I won't mention which party, it's full of socialist or dictatorial states who all hate the US, so we're not going to get into it. The Coast Guard would be the leading figure here, but the Coast Guard is looking at its responsibilities for training African Coast Guards, whereas the U.S. Navy says, no, we should do it, and the Coast Guard said, no, we do it, and so on. But we're going to be chairing the Arctic Council in 2015. And our strategy, well, I give you what the Arctic Institute of the United States, a private organization, has said. It's as elusive as a mirage on the Arctic ice sheet. Certain poetry there. The final word. This is hard to see, but there's a red line on this map, and that's the cruise of a Chinese icebreaker, the Snow Dragon, which left Shanghai and made it all the way, as you can see, across Russia and back. Its destination point was Reykjavik. A remarkable cruise from an icebreaker from China, interested in the Arctic. And what is that final word? You can read it for yourself. Whether or not the U.S. wants to pay attention to the Arctic, when we become, especially when we become the #2 economic power, which is coming up, we're going to have to pay attention to the Arctic because they are paying attention to the Arctic, even as our good friends the Canadians are and everybody else. So that's what I see coming. I see it remaining a peaceful area, and the U.S. gradually, against its own interests sometimes, getting involved and paying more attention to the Arctic. And I think that is all to the good. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for mentioning China, because I hope that will stir up interest in our panel tomorrow morning, where we have a number of presentations on the interest of China and also other Asian powers. I'm now going to give the floor to Dr. Jakub Godzimirski, originally from Poland, but now working at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs in Oslo. He is going to introduce us to Russian policies set in a broader perspective, and I understand that he will also bring the story up to date with what has been happening since the Ukrainian crisis. You have the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this kind invitation to join you at this discussion. What I'm going to do today is to give you some better insights into Russian Arctic policies, but I will place it in a broader context of Russian foreign and security policy, and as mentioned a minute ago, I will also try to make it fit into this current situation developing in Europe. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is I give you some understanding of the official Russian take on the Arctic. I will also take a look at how the Russian expert community approaches the Arctic issues. I will also pay some attention to the role of various Russian media in this debate, but towards the end of the presentation I will also take a look at how the Ukrainian crisis may have influenced the developments also in the Arctic. And when we look at those three pictures, those represent the geographical space, the legal space, and the geopolitical space, and all those three are going to be very much present in my presentation. In order to give you what is my understanding of Russian politics, I used to use this model in order to give some ideas. I think that it's important to understand that there are some main ideas that guide Russian policy making. There is a process of conceptualization of this policy as here represented by various official documents. There are some structural factors that make something happen and prevent some other things from happening, and then there are a number of policies, and I treat Russian Arctic policy as a part of Russian grand strategy. To give you an idea of what I mean by structural factors, those are the Russian revenues generated by the Russian oil and gas industry over the last 40 years. And I think this really gives some good understanding of what we are talking about. Russia is an important global player, mostly due to the fact that they earn a lot of money from selling gas, oil and petroleum products to some others. And those others in this case are mostly European countries. When we talk about the broader context of Russian policy, it's important to have a kind of long-term historical look at the policy. Those are the 4 points identified by Cyril Black in his chapter in a book on Russian and Soviet foreign policy published in 1962. He identified those 4 elements as the long-term goals of Russian policy: stabilization of frontiers, assurance of favorable conditions for economic growth in Russia, unification of Russian territories, and participation in alliance system. And we see all those elements being at play also today. Some of them are more prominent, others are more in the shadows, but still very much present. And former ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, has identified 7 goals he meant Putin was pursuing in the first half of 2014. And I think this gives also a good understanding of the broader context of Russian Arctic policy today. And last but not least, the foreign policy concept published by Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2013 says that foreign policy is one of the most important tools in Russian grand strategy, and it also describes this policy as being transparent, predictable, and pragmatic. This is probably something that could be very much discussed today. When it comes to things Arctic, this is the official definition of the Russian understanding of what is Arctic in Russia. But Russia, as a former superpower, as a re-emerging great power with some global ambitions, has also some Arctic ambitions beyond the very limited scope of things Arctic in Russia. So we have to understand that for Russia, Arctic is about both domestic politics but also about foreign policy. There is also a very clear history of Russian interest in the Arctic. During the communist period, the Arctic played different parts. During the Second World War, for instance, this was an area where the link between Russia and the Western Allies was strong. During the Cold War, this was an area where Russia expected some things to come from the other part of the Arctic. So this is also a very strategic perspective. During the post-communist period, we see three main elements of Russian interest in the Arctic. There is the geopolitical idea. Andrei Kokoshin has been talking a lot about the northern bastion. There is the issue of Russian borders. Russia's longest border is in the Arctic, in fact. There are some economic aspects, and there is also this very strong interest in this northern sea route. So those are the three elements that somehow guide Russian policies in the Arctic in the post-communist period. There is a number of actors operating in the Arctic, both in Russia, but when dealing with Arctic issues, Russia has also to relate to some other actors. This is a kind of symbolic representation of this actorness in the context of the Arctic policies. And then there has been a lot of discussion in Russia about the Arctic, but there is also a lot of action. And this is a list of the most important elements of Russian actions in the Arctic, starting with various types of concepts and policy documents, and ending up with some steps being taken, like this, for instance, planting of this Russian flag on the sea bottom at the Northern Pole in 2007 by this expedition led by Alexander Chilingarov. It's important also to understand what is the Arctic issues placed in Russian strategic documents. This is an overview of the most important documents describing Russian take on foreign security and defense policy, but also on some more specific issues. And on the next slide, you will see that the interest in the things Arctic has increased strongly in Russia. This is a list of the occurrences of the term Arctic in Russian official documents, starting in 1993 with the foreign policy concept, ending up with the newest of those strategic documents, foreign policy concept from 2013. And we see that there is an increase in the Russian interest in the Arctic. In the last document, Arctic is mentioned 14 times, and it's not purely by chance. In 2008, Russia published a document on Russian Arctic strategy, and this document outlines Russian interest in the Arctic. If we follow the Russian debate today, we see that there is a kind of strong opposition. On the one hand, there is a lot of focus on the Arctic as an area of cooperation, but there is also a lot of focus on potential conflicts that could emerge in the Arctic. And this issue of Arctic as a zone of peace and cooperation is somehow also seen in the context of potential conflict, because this very document describes this area as a zone of peace and cooperation, but at the same time there are some references being made to military aspects of the Russian policy in the Arctic. And this is also very clearly shown in the assignment of various types of forces in the Arctic. This really shows the preeminence of the Arctic in the military context. Even today, approximately 60–70% of Russian strategic submarines are located in the Northern Fleet, which has the Arctic area as its main theater of operations. So Arctic is still very important for Russia from the kind of military point of view. And we should remember this, because Russia seems to be willing to use this military instrument for the time being, not in the Arctic, but in some other places. We also have to understand that Arctic has a place in this Russian debate on security, but this document from 2009 treats the Arctic as an area of mostly cooperation between Russia and some other actors. Since most of the revenue in Russia is being generated by energy resources, it's important for Russia also to have a kind of coherent approach to the Arctic. If we look at the list of the Russian regions that form a part of the Russian Arctic, we find there the Yamal Autonomous Okrug and Khanty-Mansiysk Autonomous Okrug. Those two okrugs, those two Russian regions produce more than 80% of Russian gas and oil, and this really shows how important Arctic is for Russia. And this was also probably one of the reasons why one of the sanctions that have been imposed quite recently due to the Russian operations in Ukraine has also some focus on the Arctic. There is one of the elements of the sanction is the limitation of Russian Western cooperation in the Arctic oil development. Arctic is interesting not only for Russian policymakers but also for Russian expert community. This is a graph showing the occurrence of the term Arctic in one of the most important Russian outlets for discussion of foreign and security policy, Russia and global affairs, and we see that there has been a very clear increase of the interest in the Arctic in this outlet. This outlet publishes text both by Russian and by Western experts. Russian experts have paid a lot of attention to the question of conflicts, potential conflicts in the Arctic, like exemplified by this article published by Alexandrov in 2009, when he listed a number of potential conflicts in the Arctic. But there has also been a lot of understanding that the Arctic area could also be a part of this cooperation zone between Russia and the Arctic. We see, for instance, in the article published in 2013 by Baklanov that he even saw possible cooperation between the United States and Russia in the Arctic, because those two seem to have overlapping interests, and there is also a lot of focus on these economic aspects of cooperation. A very interesting document was published only 1 week ago by the Russian expert communities meeting place, the so-called Valdai Club. On the 22nd of October, a document was published by Alexander Sergunin, Heinin, and another Russian expert on Russian Arctic policy, that outlines and gives a very good understanding of the elements of Russian thinking about Arctic. So if you are interested in learning more about this, I would really recommend you to take a look at this document, Russian Strategies in the Arctic, Avoiding a New Cold War. And this sums up to a very large extent Russian take on the Arctic. But unfortunately, there are also some other developments, not necessarily as positive as the ones taking place in the Arctic. Russian intervention in Ukraine has created a kind of new environment for cooperation in Europe, but this may also have a sort of spillover effect on cooperation with Russia in other areas. The conflict in Ukraine can be interpreted in many various ways. The Russian official take is that the conflict is a kind of intra-Ukrainian conflict between various political forces. Russia has nothing to do with this conflict. Russia may play some positive role, but Russia has no role in this conflict. But there is a clear understanding in the West that this is not only a conflict between the Russian state and the Ukrainian state, but this is also a conflict between Russia and the West, a conflict that could be described as a conflict over influence in Ukraine. So we should understand that this conflict may also have some impact on cooperation with Russia in some other fields. We have seen that both the United States and the European Union have decided to impose a number of so-called restrictive measures against Russia. Those restrictive measures have already had some impact, and unfortunately I think that those measures and this Ukrainian crisis may also have some impact on cooperation in the Arctic. When we discuss international cooperation, we tend to operate within the limits of three important paradigms. This understanding of the world as being a place of a power game, this understanding of the world as being a place where a consensus could be reached through a number of rational choices and approaches, and then there is this idea of this ideal world as, for instance, represented by the European Union, that has developed into a security community where the use of military means in order to pursue political goals is excluded. And I think that the main tension growing after the Ukrainian crisis is this tension between those three visions of the world. We see a Russia that in the Arctic context operates within this rational Lockean logics, but at the same time the very same country operates in Ukraine within the logics of the surrealism power-based policy, and how this tension is going to be played out in the Arctic in years to come, it's still an open question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this really huge amount of information that you managed to fit into a short time. We'll now welcome Dr. Asle Toje, who is the research director for the Norwegian Nobel Institute in Oslo. And he is going to talk about Norwegian policy and strategy. If I remember rightly, Norway was the first country actually to put a strategy on paper for the Arctic, but he will suggest that within that apparently clear or leading Norwegian role, there are a number of tensions and contradictions. So we look forward to that. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Yes, as you all know, there are many differences in Norwegian policies, but the one thing that is constant is that we are always leading. From a Norwegian perspective, that is. So, let's see, this clicker, how it...
You use the keyboard.
Oh, I'll just use the keyboard. Is there a keyboard here?
Enter.
Ah, yes, yes, wonderful. Excellent. I'm not gonna... I guess that you're pretty much still taking in the slides from the previous presentation, so I'm not going to put all that much on the PowerPoint view here. I'm just going to start off with a bit of history, because history is important when it comes to Norway's Arctic policies. From a Norwegian perspective, the Arctic is Norway's near abroad. Have no mistake about it. Norway has a sense of entitlement to a lot of these areas that ties in with our history, going back a lot of time, approximately 1,000 years. Back in the day, we had this notion of the Norwegian realm, that was the islands in the north and to the west. Of course, we lost this backyard with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And in 1821, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Shetland, left with Denmark as part of the price that we had to pay not to take on Denmark's debts after having been ceded from Denmark to Sweden. In the late 1800s, there was a great deal of interest in the Arctic. It became a very important part of Norwegian nation building. Fridtjof Nansen skied across Greenland in 1888, captured the imagination of the Norwegian people. Later, in 1911, Roald Amundsen was the first man to get to the South Pole, and this all ties in to a period of Norwegian expansion into the Arctic area, sometimes referred to as ice-ocean imperialism. Towards the end of World War I, in the peace treaties, Norway gained sovereignty over the Bear Island and Svalbard, Spitsbergen, and in 1933, our attempt at gaining ownership to the eastern parts of Greenland lost out in the court in The Hague. During the Cold War, everything got cooled down a lot. Security was the main, the main focus in Norwegian policies towards the north. Keep in mind that Norway was the only NATO state that had an exposed border directly towards the Soviet Union, and this was sort of a double jeopardy, because at Svalbard the Russians were the only, the Soviets were the only state that had actually taken up on their right to carry out commerce on the islands. So we had the Norwegian settlement, and there was also the Russian settlement that had to be handled. And this, as those of you who are old enough to remember, during the Cold War was tricky business. And for that reason, Norway, we demilitarized our northernmost county, and we kept a policy where the goal was actually to keep things at a low level of confrontation, which also led to us doing very little in the north. In 1987, Gorbachev held his Murmansk speech, which to my mind is the reason why we're all here. The Soviet leader of the Communist Party then reached out to Western countries with a desire to cooperate on rescue, on the environment, on the minor issues, on low politics issues in the high north. And this was very much welcomed by Norway. And ever since 1987, we have seen, and I think Charles Emerson, who I stole this image of the North from his book, The Future of the Arctic, he calls it a slow motion scramble, and it has indeed been a slow motion scramble. You will see that every now and then we get a lot of focus, and there's a lot of anticipation about what's going to happen, all these great things that are going to happen in the Arctic, and then things cool down and start going slowly again. So we're still in the phase of the slow motion scramble. In the Norwegian policy environment, there have been a great many initiatives about the Arctic. And one of the first successful initiatives was the Barents Cooperation Dialogue with the Soviet Union, which was an attempt from Norway's behalf to gain a greater degree of predictability of our relations with the neighbor in the east. But keep in mind that when Norwegians talk about Arctic cooperation, Russia will always loom large. This is our near abroad, and our relations with our great power neighbor to the east is paramount in Norwegian policy debates. One of the first things that actually this dialogue actually yielded was cleaning up the nuclear submarines that were rusting all along the Kola Peninsula. Great work done. The Soviet Union didn't have any good routines in place for dealing with the decommissioned nuclear installments, and through joint cooperation we actually managed to get a lot of that fissile material out of the rusting hulls. Then in 1998 the government, the center-right government, came up with a white paper on what they called the near abroad, and this led up to the effort that I believe has been very important in funding a lot of the activities that some of you will have been to, and it's called, in Norwegian, it translates into the High North effort. This effort was very much tied in with the person and the personality of Jonas Gahr Støre, then Foreign Minister of Norway, now leader of the Labour Party. Without getting too political, it seems to me a safe claim that it has been the Labour Party in Norway that has been in the lead, and other parties, when in government, have more or less been content to continue the efforts that have been launched by the Labour Party. This High North effort was launched first in 2005. We saw from some of the previous presentations that this debate was carried out through the 1990s, but in 2005 it was the first real Norwegian effort at bringing together all the dimensions of the policies, and Jonas Gahr Støre pointed to three key dimensions for Norway: 1, the environment; 2, the security; and 3, economy. Keeping in mind that the northern regions and the Arctic regions for Norway has been less economically developed than we would like for them to be. What happened with this High North effort is the thing that sometimes happened with policy initiatives, and that is that it quite quickly turned into the family Christmas tree. All foreign policies have an internal dimension and an external dimension. It has the dimension that we want to project on the world, maybe even change the world. And then you have the dimension where you're telling your own population that we're on the job and we're doing it really well. Keep that in mind next time you vote. And for the internal dimension to work, the High North effort was allowed to become a sort of family Christmas tree where everybody was allowed to hang their favorite ornament, I counted out the priorities, and to my count, there were 20 of them. Everything from a better dialogue with the neighbors, and of course we have great dialogue with all neighbors except for Russia, so that was neighbors means Russia there. Stronger degree of institutionalization, oil and gas exploration, industrial cooperation with the Russians, again border cooperation with the Russians, to renew our naval presence in terms of search and rescue, further knowledge development that ties into the environment, sea rescue missions, to bring in skilled migrants to our northernmost counties that are sparsely populated, develop the fish farming industry, which is a huge industry in Norway, bring it further north, better fishing governance, environmental mapping, monitor climate change, nuclear security, higher learning clusters, that's the universities and high schools, etc. in the north, scholarship programs, cultural cooperations, again with Russia, marine bioengineering, developing the Northeast Passage, and to develop train links with Russia. As is often the case with initiatives that gain so many dimensions and priorities, is that they frequently end up being overburdened and underdriven, and that is unfortunately what happened to the High North effort. Because in 2010 we achieved a huge success seen from Norwegian eyes, and that was that we agreed the delineation border with Russia in the sea. This is something that Norway had been working towards for 50 years, and it happened in 2010, and all rejoiced. Not so much in Russia, but at least in Norway. Another great success was the seed vault at Svalbard, where we have brought in seeds from a great many of the plants in the world for safekeeping at Svalbard. Another success is what one might call the environmentalization of Svalbard. It's always been a headache for Norway, this fact that Norway thinks that the Svalbard and Spitsbergen are sovereign Norwegian territories, and unfortunately not all other countries in the world agree on that. And unfortunately there's also a treaty that allows everybody else to carry out commerce at Svalbard. The Norwegian solution has been to environmentalize it, so nobody does commerce at Svalbard because of the environment. And that has been quite successful. We have brought scholars to Svalbard, and there's a lot of research going on there now. And so we staved off these efforts that we saw in the 1990s, where a lot of the signatories to the Svalbard Convention were looking into building power plants and doing mineral extraction, etc. at Svalbard, which is not what Norway would like to happen. We would like for these islands to remain at least where they are currently under Norwegian jurisdiction. So, what is the internal dimensions of foreign policy worked great. Jonas Gahr Støre, who launched the High North Initiative, well, he's now the leader of the Labour Party, probably a future Prime Minister of Norway, so it worked great for him. And it also served to give a direction to Norwegian foreign policy. It seemed that we had a government that had a very clear priority about what they wanted to do, and that worked out really well. Politically, it worked out really well. What didn't work out so well was the external dimensions, especially with Russia. The High North effort was based on a liberal institutionalist dictum, this notion that if we treat Russia as if they were Sweden, Russia will become Sweden. Oh, no, don't laugh about it. This is when you look at Norwegian foreign policy, for instance, go back to the, I'm not going to get into ancient history again, but 2008 Georgian War, Sweden, top of the hawks, really, really aggressive when it comes to wanting very strong language against Russia. Norway, the biggest of the doves. We were very, very silent there. And this is very much to do with the North and the Arctic for Norway, because it is in our interest to keep these relations with the Russians on an even keel, and that means that Norway has taken the back seat on being, amongst the detractors of Russian policies, and we now have a functional relationship. But Russia hasn't turned into Sweden, and we find that the Russians proved rather difficult to cooperate with on the economic side. On the one hand, we have gained a pretty substantial Russian minority in our northernmost city, towards the border, Kirkenes. So we did bring in skilled migrants from Russia, but in recent times we've seen increased Russian naval activities, and I think this is sort of just one of the great stories of our times, that Russia is refusing to play the role that has been assigned to it by Western powers, and Norway in a very small way has found this when it comes to the northern dimension. So if we have a semi-successful policy, why does it come across as so damn successful when you look at academic papers? Well, this is due to the Norwegian government doing something that the EU often does, and that is to generously fund academic studies. And generously funded academic studies tend to reveal that what is being studied is indeed important, and that it will remain increasingly important. And only, if more money was to be released for scholarship funds and etc., it will keep on growing into the sky. And this has been a part of why we've been talking so much about the northern dimension in Norway. And that is the role where the academician plays the role of prophet, and even if the high north dimensions of Norwegian foreign policies is a rather mixed bag of initiatives that we would be carrying out regardless, and a good way to communicate with voters in the north, I think that we will probably see that the Arctic agenda of Norway will be carried out. Our current foreign minister, Børge Brende, has pledged to continue the efforts that have been launched, and I think that we will continue to build on the successes. But the big issue now for Norway is to try to find a way to handle a resurgent Russia that did not play the role that we had hoped that they would play, and we haven't quite figured out what kind of role they themselves want to play in the Arctic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asle. I think many people will be coming to you to say, how can we get our hands on this Norwegian money? And we are very ready to praise Norwegian policies if necessary. Well, I promised you would have 5 minutes. You will have 5 minutes to stretch your legs now, but we will start again exactly at 1:45. And I would ask our next speaker, Alexander, not to go too far away, because I will expect him to be prompt.